Hello, my name is Debbie Doyle. I'm the meetings manager here at the American Historical Association. Thank you for attending our roundtable on Oceanic Worlds, which is part of the AHA Colloquium series of Virtual AHA. We're excited to have you join us today and are looking forward to a productive discussion. I'd like to thank our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. You can support Virtual AHA and other AHA activities by joining the AHA, or if you're already a member, making a donation today. We will post links with details in the chat at the end of the session. A few logistical things to consider before we start the webinar. By registering for or participating in the AHA's webinars, participants and panelists agree to abide by the AHA's Code of Professional Conduct. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions to the presenters. We hope to address all relevant questions, but we also want to be mindful of the time, so we may paraphrase or combine questions. We'll also open up the chat in a few minutes so people can share resources and engage in conversation. If you'd like to be part of the conversation on social media, remember to use the Virtual AHA hashtag. Finally, a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording on the AHA YouTube channel soon. Now I'd like to turn things over to the chair of our session today, Bathsheba Demuth from Brown University. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you all for joining us in this virtual format. It's my pleasure and honor to chair this panel this afternoon, coming to you from where I am on Narragansett and Wampanoag lands in what is now Rhode Island, to where all of you are out in the virtual universe. And my particular thanks to all the amazing folks at the AHA behind the scenes who are making this run very smoothly. I'm going to just very briefly introduce the topic of today's roundtable, the idea of ocean histories and oceanic maritime spaces for historians, introduce our panelists, and then we will jump right in. The kind of reason for this roundtable coming together is a confluence of new work on ocean histories over the past 5 or 10 years, ways in which oceanic framings growing out of the trend of Atlantic world history has turned marine spaces into a kind of provocative site of historical research and analysis. Today's roundtable draws together people with expertise on a wide variety of aspects of ocean history and a wide cast of oceans, from the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and the Arctic Oceans. And you will see in their responses to today's questions how diverse the subfields that are being pulled into maritime history are. Not just maritime history itself, but indigenous history, environmental history, and histories of science, among others, are becoming really full vocal components of this field. The goal of today is to have a real roundtable. That is, the panelists are not going to be sharing slides and presenting formal work, but instead are going to be answering a series of questions that I put forward. We have 3 big questions today. They will all kind of respond to them in turn. And then at the end of those 3 questions, we will open it up to your questions, which you can start adding in the Q&A function there at the bottom of your screen. In addition, if you have material related to ocean and maritime history that you want to share as the discussion gets going, you can drop that in the chat function, and we will be collecting those in a Google Doc to kind of spur or help people see the ways in which this field is unfolding. So now for our participants. My name is Bathsheba Demuth. I maybe should have said that at the top. I'm an assistant professor of history and environment and society at Brown University, and write often about the histories of the marine spaces in the very far north. But the real stars of today's discussion are our panelists. And I'm going to start with Boyd Cothran, who's an associate professor in the Department of History at York University, where he specializes in 19th century Indigenous history. He's the author of the prize-winning Remembering the Modoc War, Redemptive Violence, and the Making of American Innocence, which came out in 2014. And he also writes for the New York Times, Indian Country Today, and other venues, both public and academic, and has edited 2 collections. He's currently finishing a book-length project combining global history and microhistory titled Edwin Fox, the extraordinary story of how an ordinary sailing ship connected the world in the age of globalization, which he's co-authoring with Adrian Schubert. Our next panelist is Josh Reid, a registered member of the Snohomish Indian Nation and an associate professor of American Indian Studies and the John Calhoun Smith Memorial Endowed Professor of History at the University of Washington. His first book, The Sea is My Country, The Maritime World of the Makah, has won more awards than time allows me to name. He currently directs the Center for the Study of the Pacific Northwest and edits the Emil and Kathleen Six series on Western history and biography with UW Press, and the Roe Cloud series on American Indians in modernity. Reid is currently researching indigenous explorers in the Pacific from the late 18th to the end of the 19th century. Helen Roswadowski is founder of the Maritime Studies program at the University of Connecticut, where she teaches the history of science, environmental history, and public history. Her multiple award-winning books explore how people know the ocean, including most recently the book Vast Expanses, A History of the Ocean, published by the wonderful Reaction Books, and The Sea Knows No Boundaries, which explores the 20th century marine sciences that support international fisheries. Recently, she's co-edited Soundings and Crossings, Doing Science at Sea, one of several volumes that have established the field of the history of oceanography. And she also edits the Oceans in Depth series at the University of Chicago Press. And our last panelist is Coll Thrush, professor of history at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver and faculty associate at UBC's Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies. He is author of the prize-winning Native Seattle, Histories from the Crossing Over Place, and Indigenous London, which examines that city's history through the experiences of Native travelers, willing or otherwise, from the territories that became the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Coll's current project in its early stages is called Wrecked, Ecologies of Failure in the Graveyard of the Pacific, and is a critical cultural and environmental history of shipwrecks, settler colonialism, and indigenous survivance on the outer coast of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. So you can see why it is my honor and pleasure to hear these four speakers address the questions that are to come. We talked about these questions a little bit in advance, so hopefully folks know what's coming. The plan for today is to spend about 10 minutes on each of these. So each participant will pitch in for a couple of minutes each. And again, if you in the audience have questions as topics come up, please drop them in the Q&A, and we'll be keeping an eye on that as it goes. I'm going to start this afternoon with a question that is beloved of environmental historians, which is perhaps not surprising coming from me, which is the question of scale. And oceans offer, I think, a variety of ways of thinking about scale. They're scaled in depth, in surface area, and of course, in time. So I am very interested to hear all of your thoughts on how you scale the histories that you write, and in particular, if and how you put constraints on the potential limitlessness of the ocean. Do you write about regions like the Indian Ocean or the Caribbean? Do you write about categories of ocean space like tides? How much land is part of your seas, and how much sea below the surface is part of your histories? And on top of that, what are the temporal scales that come into play? I don't think we have an established order, so.
Maybe I'll jump in because I have some pretty expansive boundaries to not put on our topic. I'd like to start out by pointing out the unbelievably vast scale of the oceans, which I think testifies to the importance of overcoming what I think of as the terrestrial bias of history. We all know that the oceans cover about 3/4 of the Earth's surface, but consider that they constitute 99% of the planet's living space. In terms of timescales, the Earth formed 4 billion years ago and the oceans appeared only 500 million years later. Life evolved in the oceans, and recent research is demonstrating connections between even early hominids in the oceans. So I want to start by saying that deep time is and should be part of ocean history. The ocean scale presents spatial challenges, I think, to historians who are generally more comfortable with explicitly defined units of time and place. Whereas ocean tides and currents assure that there is literally no place on the ocean that is ever the same, that's ever constant. Ocean history can, of course, following terrestrial history, focus on specific places so that, for example, histories of the Indian Ocean or the Kuroshio Current or Sydney Harbor, to offer a few possibilities, are incredibly valuable, and we should be writing those kind of histories. But my recent research has been suggesting to me the robustness of the category of undersea for the post-World War II that reminds me of the category of deep ocean or tides in the mid-19th century. In surveying recent scholarship, I see some evidence for the efficacy of writing about categories of the Earth's spaces, especially oceanic or coastal spaces. For example, I think there's been interesting work on islands and beaches. I think there could be work on gyres. There's interesting work on upwelling zones, seamounts. These kind of categories of ocean space have been, and I think could be, very productive. So to look at the undersea, I find the same, looking at undersea exploration in the 1950s and 60s, I find that the same motives and technology that drew increasing numbers of people into the ocean depths also sent people underwater in lakes and rivers, so that the history of undersea exploration in the 1950s and 60s jumps from California beaches to Lake Winnipesaukee, to an Alabama quarry, to the Mediterranean Sea, to the Danube River, all in order to chronicle this part of ocean's history. And to give one, I think, really fascinating example, the undersea habitat, now known to only explorer divers of Wisconsin's Lake Mendota, still stands in mute testimony to this period of intense cultural fascination with the undersea. So while local histories of each of these waters and events and people involved with them could be written and should be written, I think there's also a power to in how these different undersea sites together come together to tell an important story.
I guess I could jump in next. Thinking about this question of scale, it's something that I've struggled with in my past work. The history that I've written has tended to be really place-based and largely about cities up to this point. And so in that work, I tend to oscillate between the local and the global. So looking at a neighborhood like, I don't know, Whitechapel in London, but thinking about it in the context of transatlantic and trans-Pacific imperialism, to create these indigenous spaces within the so-called capital of the empire. And so I tend to oscillate between the local and global, and the national gets kind of lost in that mix. That's just been kind of the way I've worked up to this point. And as I think about this work I'm doing now with shipwrecks in a region that's known as the graveyard of the Pacific, we're talking about 2,000 or 3,000 shipwrecks in the Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia coastline. I'm taking kind of a longue durée approach in terms of scale. And what that means is that, I'm talking about a couple dozen indigenous nations and 5 or 6 language families and multiple colonial nations that are in play beginning in the late 17th century. So Russian, Spanish, British, American, and Canadian. And these shipwrecks also included international crews, so Chilean and Norwegian and so on. So even before the era of giant shipping freighters that we think of as kind of this internationalized space that we have now off the coast, this was always already transnational space for me. And so I'm really thinking in those scales all the time. The US and Canada will matter in this story, but only so much. And that's because one of the things I'm trying to do here is temporally really think about colonialism and settler colonialism as being kind of shallow phenomena set against the really deep inhabitants and deep sovereignties of indigenous peoples along the coast. And so you have 10, 12, 14,000 years, however many years, contrasted with 300 or 400 years. And so I'll talk more a little bit about this in the later discussion around metaphor. But for me to try to take a really longue durée approach temporally really for me highlights the potential fragilities of empire and the recentness of empire, which I think does a lot of important work. So I'll stop there for now, but looking forward to coming back to some of these questions.
I'll go ahead and dive in. So I peg my approach to grappling with the scale of histories of ocean spaces by focusing on how a distinct group of people know a specific marine space at a particular time. This, of course, has changed over time depending on a number of factors. So my first project, as you know, is about the Makah Nation. So it's actually interesting to kind of think about how Coll was saying, and what I'm doing with histories of the ocean, kind of sets the nation off to the side. Well, I'm actually privileging and prioritizing the Makah Nation, which I think kind of speaks to this, Makah longue durée of their relationship with the ocean. So the Makahs are at the most northwestern point of the contiguous United States, and my work examines how they knew and continue to know the sea through their practices. I'll only touch on a few of those today. Of course, there's regular fishing and hunting activities that help to define Makah marine space over which they held authority. They fished for salmon and halibut offshore. Makah halibut banks were propertied items owned by specific authority figures and their families, and they were located 40 or more miles offshore. They regularly hunted seals and whales from canoes up to at least 100 miles offshore, up to the 1920s. We can comfortably argue that this 100-mile offshore zone was part of propertied Makah marine space. With their access to schooners and steam-powered tugboats from the 1870s on, they expanded their marine mammal hunting activities, going as far abroad as the coast of Japan, the Bering Sea, and Northern California. Now, I would not argue that this was Makah marine space in a propertied sense, but this certainly broadened the breadth of marine water they knew and the ocean space that I analyzed in the book. Makahs also knew the ocean by traveling across it in their canoes and in other vessels in later periods. This regularly brought them deep into Puget Sound, down the coast to the mouth of the Columbia River, or north up to the tip of Vancouver Island. Speaking of that Makah longue durée, they have oral histories talking about taking canoes up to Haida Gwaii, farther north along the coast of British Columbia, which is a considerable distance, especially in a canoe. Now, Makahs also studied the nearby seafloor along the continental shelf, kind of speaking to Helen's point that we need to not overlook the depths of the ocean. And what's interesting is that Makahs monitored the health of their halibut banks by crafting lines from dried kelp, and they rubbed slug slime on the bottom of like a bull kelp bulb. And at the end of the line, they'd play it out until it hit the bottom of the seafloor and kind of bounced along it for a while, and then pulled it up and looked at what the seafloor looked like. And they did this regularly to monitor the health of those halibut banks. Now, keep in mind that on this continental shelf area, those halibut banks are a good 200 to 600 feet underwater. It's a lot of dried kelp. So defining the sea then through Makah practices allowed me to frame a bounded space, which is something I think we all grapple with as historians with any topic we're studying, and to examine it historically.
I guess I'll jump in at this point too, and thank you for the question. It's been really interesting to hear everyone's response and all the different ways people have picked up this question of scale and looked at it differently. And I guess I'll look at it from another angle, which is in some senses to think about regionalism, and thinking about how I do think regionalism is still a really productive concept. I just taught in my graduate seminar earlier this semester, Sunil Amrit's Crossing the Bay of Bengal. And I thought that was it was a very generative book that kind of reframed a lot of our thinking about the Bay of Bengal. But increasingly, I've been thinking more and more about how to think oceanic history into global histories, and to kind of move beyond regionalism. And a lot of this has been motivated by my book that I'm finishing up right now. And I'm writing this book with a colleague, and it's following the voyages of a single merchant ship built in Calcutta in 1853 that had a sailing life all the way into the 20th century. And in that, and in looking at that, we haven't, at first I think we thought that it might be a kind of Indian Ocean project, thinking about sailing around in those areas. But as we followed and we looked at the oceanic world from the decks of a single ship, You know, in a lot of ways, the question we began asking was more about how can we push oceanic history into broader and broader realms of global history. And it started making us think about questions like, what does it mean to write a oceanic history of a place like Mongolia or like the Sahara, right? You know, how can we show that these places, which are so far removed from what we would commonly think of as the ocean, are actually deeply integrated into an oceanic history. And I'll just give you one brief example, minding the time, which is, you know, in one afternoon in 1886 or so, the Edwin Fox arrived in the South Island of New Zealand with a shipment of all kinds of stuff, and included in its shipment was a floating department store kind, bringing everything a British lifestyle needed for a settler colonial society in Aotearoa. One of the things on that ship was a piano. And that really struck me as quite interesting, because we could tell a whole story about how the piano was central to settler colonial society, to the making of a Victorian identity, to the establishment of a British sensibility on the colonial landscape, remaking of a small Britain in the middle of the Pacific. But it also allowed us to tell stories about the making of that piano and the kind of dramatic environmental histories of globalization and loss and destruction that entailed. And tracing the making of that piano brought us all the way deep into the heart of the Congo, where elephants were hunted for their ivory tusks. And that ivory created long chains of human exploitation deep into the interior, all the way to slave ports like on the East African coast. Right, but also allowed us to tell stories about the human impact of globalization that looked at something like sleeping sickness, because sleeping sickness at the same time was exploding in that part of Africa, and the main vector for sleeping sickness is the tsetse fly, and the tsetse fly thrives in green, lush canopies, and elephants were transforming the landscape. And the death, knocking down these trees, and the death of those so many elephants allowed the tsetse fly to expand. So all these stories, I'm cutting it short and leaving out a lot of details, but all these stories kind of tie an oceanic world and tie these little nodules together into more of a global historical perspective. And I think that thinking more about oceanic histories in places other than the ocean could also help us think about how central the ocean is to global history as well.
That was wonderful, not just because Boyd's comment kind of ended up back touching on where Helen started, but also because we were right on time. I didn't have to cut anyone off, which makes me very happy as chair. The second question has to do with a theme that started to come up in the first round of responses, which has to do with the ways that you all in your research encounter and engage with how people in the past knew the ocean through different epistemological traditions, ways of laboring on the sea, religious practices. But you are also all in the business of making knowledge about the ocean, particularly by writing about it. So I would like to hear about the ways in which these kind of past forms of knowing the ocean have influenced or support your writing in the present, and what other tools and modes you bring to making the seas, those spaces that are both so very material and also filled with layers of metaphor, into narratives.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and dive in, shake up the order of talking here a little bit. So I already addressed portions of this question a bit in my earlier answer, but I'd like to build on this by pointing out that for indigenous coastal peoples such as the Macaws, they knew and experienced the sea as the most important part of their homelands, and it remains this way to them today. They derived a rich living from the sea, and this was more than just subsistence. Marine products made them wealthy and influential throughout the region, both before and after the arrival of non-natives. As I argue in my book, Macaws drew their identity from the sea. They call themselves the Quiditcha'at, which means the people of the Cape. And this differentiated them from other peoples. Neighboring indigenous peoples are the ones who called them Macaws, which means generous with food because of the extraordinary feasts that they hosted. They were able to do this because of the wealth they drew from their marine homelands. I've already mentioned briefly that, that they had property over particular marine spaces, and they protected these property spaces from outsiders. Some of the usual ways, like deploying violence and threats to repel non-macaws who intruded on their waters, through reserving rights to their marine homelands through the 1855 Treaty of Nia Bay, which they signed with the United States. They regulated non-macaw fishing and hunting on their waters, even enforcing these regulations against non-natives until the 1880s. And they've been using the federal courts to protect their treaty rights to marine waters and resources since the 1890s. So knowing the ocean in this way as a critical part of their homelands also reflected their relations with the sea and other than human kin, whales, halibut, salmon, who also share these marine waters. Not only did macaws express this relationship through fishing and hunting other than human kin who gave themselves to the people of the Cape, but they also expressed these relations through reciprocity by caring for the sea and especially the other than human kin. And they did this through ritual preparations and ceremonies tied to marine practices, such as whaling and sealing and fishing. And they respected what they took from the sea. They observed a number of protocols that minimized wasting sea mammals and fish, and they kept their marine waters clean. And then the final point that I just want to make here gets back to Bathsheba's question about how we, kind of get to know the sea. And personally, I know this part of the ocean by spending time in it, on it, and along the coast. And this really comes not only from being an Indigenous historian, but also from being an environmental historian. We, deeply value how, that you have to know experientially the spaces that we research and write about. And that's, important with ocean history too.
Let me, in the spirit of mixing things up, let me kind of hop in maybe here a little bit, because I think that when I was thinking about this question over the last week, I got myself down a rabbit hole that I think is a little bit different than how like I think Coll's going to speak about this, which is more rooted in the writing practice. I thought about this question more as the problem of knowledge in an oceanic world. Josh just kind of said that he knows this land because of his embodied experience with it, but one of the things that I kind of thought about was how historically that knowledge at sea and that power, the knowledge of power at sea, is itself a kind of problematic for our historical agents in their time period too. Working in the 19th century and before, knowledge is power at sea, right? And knowledge of your enemy or of the trade possibilities or knowledge of navigational routes, which, as David Eigler has shown, were often acquired directly from Indigenous mariners. These things were a part of the life and death struggle at living in and on top of an oceanic world. And a lot of my thinking on this has been influenced by my reading recently of Lauren Benton and Nathan Pearl Rosenthal's excellent edited collection, A World at Sea, Maritime Practices and Global History. And then, it's also got me thinking about the problem of knowledge and knowing of the sea. Also got me thinking about technology itself as we think about the 19th century and writing about technology, or even earlier. And it made me think about my colleagues, Margaret Scotty's recent book, Sailing School, Navigating Science and Skill, in which she basically argues that the science of sailing in the early modern period wasn't all just dead reckoning or kind of folk knowledge, but that rather sailors themselves learned much of the era's navigational science through a kind of systematic study of mathematical and technical literature made possible by the print revolution. So I guess to me, like one of the questions that I want to throw out here, maybe it's something we can take up more in the Q&A section, is how do we work that problem of knowledge into our writing about the ocean in a way that is narratively productive and historically analytical? I'm not quite sure how to do that yet. I just noticed that knowledge is such an incredible problem, especially in the 19th century. And I struggle to think about how to make that problem come out on the page in analytically useful ways.
I can jump in next. For me, it's been really satisfying coming back to writing about the Northwest Coast after a decade or so of working on histories in Britain, to come back to the part of the world that I feel like I know the best. And one of my ways into that is to look for those operative metaphors that actually work and can do important labor in the writing. And and some of the problem with this particular subject, shipwrecks and so on, is that the metaphors can really get out of hand very quickly. Metaphors really, or shipwrecks can be used to describe almost anything. The dissolution of a marriage, the failure of a nation state, the Anthropocene, whatever. It's really open-ended. So in terms of thinking about the coast, I've been thinking a lot about the collision of water with shore and so on, but I'm trying to avoid there some of the metaphors of erosion that seem pretty consistently deployed in discussions of Native peoples' interactions with colonialism. So the collision metaphor doesn't quite work entirely for me. So I've been thinking a lot more about porosity, the porosity of the coast. Seabirds that nest far inland and sediment landslides off the coast, deep underwater and so on, and how this is an incredibly porous space. But ultimately, I am having to wrestle with this metaphor of shipwreck. And one of the reasons I'm wrestling with it so much is because it was operative in the times that I'm writing about. One of the arguments I'm trying to make is that non-Indigenous people have laid claims to this part of the world through loss and trauma. And in fact, the metaphor of the shipwreck becomes a kind of deepening of claims to place on the behalf of non-Indigenous peoples. And so that's a metaphor that I'm working with a lot. At the same time, I'm also thinking about the ships that wreck as metonyms, as actually the larger thing embodied. So for example, people literally building their homes, both Indigenous and settler people building their homes out of things that come off of shipwrecks. So that it is both the metaphor for colonialism, but it's also the thing itself. And so it can be a really quite overdetermined set of metaphors, but that's exactly the point, I would say, is that this set of stories about the so-called graveyard of the Pacific is one of the most potent regional stories that exists. And the shipwrecks are, at least in the European tradition, an incredibly potent metaphor and set of experiences. And here I'm really thinking about Steve Mentz's work, his book Shipwreck Ecology, that looks at the early modern period and shipwrecks and the rise of the Anthropocene, or whatever we're going to call it, and so on. And so I've been thinking about these shipwrecks as metaphors, but as origin stories. And origin stories for me is an opening to think about some of the teachings of people like the Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai Smith in decolonizing methodologies, where she really asks or invites scholars to pull apart origin stories of empire and really think about that in kind of a critical way. And so I think these moments of marine disaster are actually really good opportunities to think about that. And there, I think it fits in nicely with some of the new imperial history that's been looking at the fragilities of empire, which I think I mentioned earlier. And to think of it as this kind of fraught process rather than this overarching, overweening kind of steamroller. And so I'm still, I'm in the very early phases with this project. So I'm still trying to find kind of the metaphors that are going to actually be workable here. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm thinking about. And it's the metaphorical density, I think, of both shipwrecks and the ocean generally that makes this such a fruitful area for research and for writing practices that may ultimately end up crossing genres a bit.
So I've come to think of that the category of knowing the oceans may actually be key for writing ocean history. Quite a long time ago, I started trying to figure out whether writing ocean history would be the same as or different from writing terrestrial history. Kind of starting to think, okay, the ocean is vast, trackless, for the most part opaque, constantly in motion, resisting the imposition of boundaries. Many, though of course not all, human activities are invisible once a net has been hauled in or a ship's wake has faded. Unlike land, people have not so far managed to live in the ocean. It is fundamentally not a human environment in terms of the underwater part, because human bodies can't survive there or breathe there without technology. And that a long time ago made me think about and reflect on the importance of paying attention to technology in exploring historical relationships with the ocean, because technology has played such a strong mediating role with human interactions with it. But in my recent book, I argue that the act of knowing the ocean is central to telling ocean history. More so than for terrestrial history, I think we need to ask and come to understand how and why people sought and gained knowledge of the ocean and what they did with that knowledge. This is because knowledge about the ocean, whether created through work, through play, or through imaginative engagement, has played a central role, I think, in mediating the human relationship with the ocean. Attention to knowledge systems, to epistemology, reveals the nature and character of human relationships with the ocean. These relationships, as we've already heard examples from comments that have come up till now, are unique among different groups of people, and they change over time. So as a historian of science, I first studied how scientists came to know the ocean through tide gauges, sounding devices, and water samplers, as well as through specimens, theories, models. But as I widened my attention from the history of ocean sciences to ocean history kind of full stop, I noticed that fishers have known the ocean through their nets and ships, and through the hard-won knowledge that's passed on from generation to generation. Mariners likewise knew the ocean through sails, navigational instruments, and techniques, and also through knowledge passed down in person or in writing. People whose work does not take place on the oceans, even inland residents, can know the sea as well, through maritime novels, through passenger travel, through recreational activities like scuba diving. And attention to epistemology helped me realize the rich yield to be gained from looking historically at indigenous epistemologies, as we've already heard a bit about, and hopefully we'll talk about more. And since Bathsheba asked about the writing of history, I have to put in a little plug, if I may be allowed a minute to do that, or 30 seconds, about the new University of Chicago Oceans in Depths book series that I'm co-editing. In both my own scholarship and now through this series, I really hope that talking about ocean history will prompt scholars to reflect on whether there might be ocean histories kind of lurking or embedded in the work that they're already doing. Thanks.
Thank you all. Once again, I think that we are showing how well this roundtable format as an actual roundtable really works. These seem like really productive overlaps and discussions that weave into each other and are provoking lots of interesting questions in the chat. I get to ask one more question, and one that is tied both to the question of scale that I started with and to that second question about knowing, and that's the question of power. I think there's a strain of maritime history that's quite old, that goes back to work on navies and military actions at sea, that's focused on explicit kind of manifestations of power, and has always seen the ocean as places where imperial power is projected and places of political contest. But I'm interested in hearing how power is made, maintained, and contested in the oceans that you all study, through law and other forms of governance, as imperial and colonial spaces, and as borderlands. Thinking particularly about who and how is power exercised in your histories, and is that power defined by being maritime in some particular way?
All right, maybe I can wade in on this one first. I think, as I've mentioned before, this book that I'm working on is on globalization in the 19th century. And of course, globalization is an inherently power-related and power-making process, right? And so there's a kind of an easy way I can talk about this, is how globalization in the latter half of the 19th century was tied up with the consolidation of empire, and as well as kind of the economic inequality that would come to characterize world history after that fact. But one of the things that we're trying to emphasize in our book is actually the ways in which, or what we're trying to clarify in our book, is the ways in which globalization was a polycentric or multi-sided process. It's often understood in simplistic terms, I think, that globalization in the late 19th century was the simple byproduct of technological development or the inevitable expansion of European American capitalism into new markets. But we're trying to show the ways in which it actually was a decentralized process, and that it followed no single nation's game plan, right? And I think it's attempting to say that this was a bottom-up process, but I think one of the things that our research helps clarify is that the kind of developments and connections that we have labeled as globalization were as much the byproduct of local demands as they were of centralized policies. And that the local also created then problems for the metropole that it had to deal with, right? So that globalization was this kind of tug and pull process. And, you know, I'll give you two very quick examples. Is our ship has two voyages. We call them the voyages of unfreedom, and one is a shipment of coolies from Hong Kong to Havana, and the other one is a shipment of convicts from the UK to Western Australia. And in both those situations, without going into all the details, in both those situations, it's oftentimes the desire of local actors and local interests to pull themselves into a kind of global economy that is creating the unfreedoms that they're supplying. And so I guess in telling the story of globalization from the deck of a single ship, I think that brings the contingent and the local and the unexpected into focus. But that's not to say that these were not still developments that serve particular interests, right? That power exuded from all of these moments, especially when we think about who bore the costs and consequences of a globally interconnected oceanic world. And that perhaps power in many circumstances rested on the docks of a port city or in the sugar fields of a plantation colony, or within the prison walls of a convict colony, far more than they resided in the halls of Whitehall.
Yeah, I'll follow that. You know, as I think I said maybe in the last question, I'm really interested in stories of failure here, and stories of failure as a kind of claiming, and the moments where the maritime just doesn't work out as actually moments of power transfer, of knowledge transfer, and so on. And one of the things I'm quite interested in are stories as kind of manifestations of power, and this idea that, you know, we died, we suffered for this place as a sort of deeper sense of claiming on the part of settlers. And so I'm quite interested in that. Right now I'm working on a piece on early 19th century narratives of violence related to two early maritime disasters, one in 1803 and one in 1811, and how these came to define the region that I'm writing about in that period, what Josh in his work has called the geography of fear in the maritime fur trade. And I'm thinking about how these narratives, which were created by only a handful of white American men, both prefigure and configure later relations of violence as settler colonialism starts to take hold in the region, even as they also reflect broader patterns around race, indigeneity, land tenure, and so on in the early republic. And thinking about how, you know, someone like Washington Irving or Edgar Allan Poe is actually creating stories about this part of the world that then leads to, in some cases, military action when indigenous people are understood to be the threat to maritime adventure. And so these shipwrecks are really archivally dense events, and I think they're a good way to get at some of these power relationships. And overall, I guess I'm interested in thinking about how shipwrecks are sort of moments of crisis that illuminate these broader patterns of power. So, for example, in 1906, there's a big wreck on the BC coast called the Valencia, and a couple hundred people die. And that actually becomes an opportunity for the extension of colonial control and surveillance into the spaces along what's now the West Coast Trail on Vancouver Island, but was originally established as a shipwreck rescue trail, but it becomes kind of a colonial imposition onto the land and seascape of that space. And then in terms of power, lastly, I'll just say that in terms of thinking about the coast, I've started thinking about my own relationship to the coast. You know, I'm a suburban guy from inland. The coast for me was mostly known through clamming and a summer job and vacations and all that. And what does that kind of relationship mean in the context of a project that's interested in power in the coast? You know, how do we write from the coast if we're, my opening chapter, I think, is called The View from the Shore, where I'm kind of being honest that I don't have a background in oceanography, or I'm not a sailor. I wasn't in the Navy. I'm not a boat guy. And so what are the power relationships that are bound up in that in terms of the relationship of coastal spaces to non-coastal spaces within countries like the US and Canada? So the power relations are just so knotted up in these little moments of disaster that they just are endlessly interesting, I think, for unpacking.
All right, I'll dive in. Yeah, so in thinking about this question, there were, like all of us, there's so many different directions that we can go with this. And I thought that what I would do is focus on, kind of the point that I'd like to make, that the dynamics of settler colonialism also occur over in indigenous marine space. For those of us here in the session, that's kind of old news, but it may seem a bit odd to others at first because, settlers settle by removing forests, building farms and roads, marking out rangelands, mining, starting towns, and dividing the landscape into individually owned fee simple property. And, so much of what we think we know about settlement really orients it towards, these terrestrial projects. But settler colonialism, as we know, is about more than just settling. It also involves the erasure of native peoples, polities, and practices, replacing these with non-natives and their polities and practices itself. So this erasure also happened at sea. And for the macaws, this was turning propertied marine spaces, such as their halibut banks, into a watery commons, wherein property did not exist until an individual or a corporation removed it from the sea. It's, kind of like a flip of the normal narrative that we tell about settlement. And so this first step came through the 1855 Treaty of Nia Bay. And through this document, as we know, macaws reserved their fishing, sealing, and whaling rights in perpetuity. During the negotiations, the macaw chiefs agreed to fish together with whites. That's the language they used. From the perspective of the people of the Cape, this meant that non-macaws could fish macaw waters, but on indigenous terms. Fishing together did not mean abrogating macaw governance over and ownership of these waters. But the official treaty language codified this as the right of taking fish and of whaling or sealing at usual and accustomed grounds and stations is further secured to said Indians in common with all citizens of the United States. So through this legal sleight of hand, the US negotiators imposed their own meaning of fishing together, transforming macaw marine space into a commons. And what followed over the next few generations was a gradual erosion of macaw ownership rights over their waters. Increasing numbers of non-natives flooded these marine waters with their increasingly expensive and efficient fishing boats and gear, pushing all the fisheries to which macaws had reserved their rights into a state of crisis. And by the early 1900s, the state of Washington began passing and enforcing conservation laws that privileged non-natives and shut out Indian fishers like the macaws. But the narrative doesn't end there. In a condition of, say, indigenous declension, and macaws and other neighboring peoples have fought back in a number of ways, reclaiming the sea. Court cases are one way. Think of the 1974 US v. Washington, that infamous Bolt decision that decided in favor of the state's tribal nations, affirming that their reserved treaty rights were not just about access, but were about having an equal share of fish. Coming out of the Bolt decision, macaws and other native nations gained substantial influence in governing bodies that today manage fisheries, restoring some of their authority over marine homelands. And then I point to other practices like the annual tribal canoe journeys, recent macaw whaling efforts, and the Lummi revival of the reef net fishing. All these mark efforts at reclaiming the sea. So I think I'll wrap it up there.
And I just have two quick things to say about the category of oceans and power. The first is sort of a, ancient history reflection or historiographic reflection, depending on how you want to think about it. That when I was in graduate school, like many of my compatriots, I did put together a field on science and empire. And at the time, I didn't really notice, but today I look back and realize it was completely and utterly terrestrial. Lots of amazing work on mapping and lots and lots of land. And a few years ago, my friend and colleague Michael Reid and I published an article that we first wrote together as a conference paper 15 years ago. And when we tried to publish it at that time, it was kind of praised by one reviewer, panned by another, and we didn't really know what to do. So we kind of left it alone. And as it exists now in a 214 article, it points out how intensely and tightly interconnected are science, imperialism, and oceans, which I think is something that is meanwhile becoming increasingly obvious and is getting the attention that it deserves. And so I sort of offer that as an intersection of things we might want to talk about. But what I'd really like to say in answer to this question is to emphasize how important the category of imagination is including in the areas of law and governance. For almost 2 decades now, I've been teaching my undergraduate maritime studies students about law of the sea, a topic that when I started teaching it was far outside my expertise and comfort zone. And when I began, the only secondary works I could find were written by lawyers or political scientists, almost all of which were written by people who had been involved in some way in the conferences that formulated law of the sea. And at first that seemed great because it was an interdisciplinary course and I thought, okay, the students need to read some political science. But later, when I started becoming interested as a historian in the status of the law of the sea process in the 1960s and early 70s, I realized how problematic it was that the only accounts I could find were ones written firmly looking backward from the perspective of present legal and policy questions and not doing what historians do so well as looking at the historical context. So I started trying to understand how the cultural construction of the undersea as a frontier in the 1950s and 60s influenced the law of the sea process. And I've concluded that these accounts by non-historians downplayed the power of that metaphor relative to what I have found in the research I've done. And it's incredibly exciting to see recent work by historians on law of the sea, and including work that does not limit itself to either Grotius or the UNCLOS operations, but is really looking at ocean governance more broadly. And so I really look forward to discussing this and other things as we move on.
Thank you all for those responses, which I was taking lots of notes in the background and really appreciate. And we have questions kind of coming in the chat. Just so folks know, if you see a question that you really want answered that resonates with you, you can upvote it by hitting the little thumbs up in the corner. And I'm going to use those as a little bit of a guide to start us off. Fred Astron asks a question about the phenomenology of distance, a term that Ricardo Padron coined, and wants to know if you can talk a bit about how an oceanic view transforms our notions of space, distance, and what is proximate.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And, again, I think all four of us will address it in probably very different ways, or could approach it in very different ways. One of the ways that I've thought a little bit about that relative to the macaws is thinking about how, so much of the non-native writing about the macaws and Nia Bay and the reservation and Cape Flattery is about how ridiculously far away from everywhere it is. Like a road, didn't come in until the 1930s. And that, any Indian agent who was posted there was, kind of consigned to the edge of the world or almost out of this world. They used, language like that. And that was not at all how macaws saw, their homeland. They saw it very clearly as the center of their world. They thought nothing of crossing the Strait of Juan de Fuca to go visit family members on the west coast of Vancouver Island, which, since the, mid 19th century has been a different country from the nation state model. They regularly traveled deep into Puget Sound to visit friends, to follow labor paths, to go shopping in Seattle. One Macaw family, when they wanted to purchase a new schooner and like actually commission a new schooner, they went down to San Francisco in the 1880s to, talk to some people there about, what a schooner would look like and how much it would cost and things like that. And so they thought nothing of what were surprisingly long distances and great distances by many more terrestrially rooted Anglos who kind of saw and experienced distance in many different ways. Even canoe journeys today, there are some tribal nations that will spend weeks on the water, traveling from their home reservation to the host reservation. And for a lot of non-native peoples, it's like, how do you do that? How do you spend weeks, pulling a canoe and stopping everywhere and visiting with friends and it's like, understanding, distance and time in that sense can be very different from that indigenous perspective, which I think is tied to their long experience with the ocean.
I think that in my own work, and this is not exactly a new or original insight, but in my own work, I think that the distance is very much part of the story. When I tell people that I'm writing a book about globalization using the voyages of a single ship in the late 19th century, people always ask me, "Oh, is it a steamship?" Right? Because that's like kind of the story we expect to have, right? And I go, "No, it was a sailing ship," right? And that sort of surprises them. But the truth is, like, the economics of steam made certain long distance voyages technologically impossible for much of that period of time, and certainly economically infeasible for certain kinds of products they were sailing using. And so almost to the 20th century, the sailing ship had a very useful life in places like New Zealand, Australia, from shipments from Europe, right? That's a tremendous distance that you can take. Another fact about distance and time that I remind people of sometimes is the longest voyage you could take the longest sailing voyage you could take in the 19th century was basically like New York to San Francisco. And if people don't usually think about the tremendous distance that takes and how many days that is, but a little jaunt to India was quite a bit shorter of a voyage by sail, even around Africa, than it was to go just to San Francisco. So that kind of those kinds of realizations about the reality of travel in an oceanic world, I think, is really important to understanding larger processes like globalization or the ways in which an interconnected world was developed in the late 19th century.
I would like to answer that question by saying a little something about space and distance in the mid 19th century. I've studied the deep ocean, and the deep ocean is arguably far away and known only by this handful of people who were doing deep sea soundings and submarine telegraphy. And yet, when you look, I've always thought it would be really fun to have a museum exhibit on 19th century discovery of the deep ocean, where the first place you walk into is a kind of a reconstruction of a Victorian parlor, because you would have an aquarium and you would have maritime novels and you would have perhaps sailors' valentines, these kind of elaborate collections of shells, or maybe a shell collection or a seaweed notebook. You'd have enormous amounts of piano music about the Atlantic Telegraph polka, that sort of thing. You would have many, many, many pieces of material culture that would make it so clear that the deep ocean was really a very meaningful place in people's minds and hearts, even though, they might live on a coast, but they might not.
I think for me, the main thing that I would amplify from what Josh has said in particular is to really critically examine this concept of remoteness versus homelands and home waters. I think that's something that I'm really coming across in in descriptions of these particular wrecks, that these are wild coasts and all that kind of language that is almost Turnerian in its form. But in terms of distance, one of the things I'm also really interested in is when the hyperglobal meets the hyperlocal. When you have Christmas trees that were bound for Hawaii suddenly washing up on the beach, and everybody's using them in their homes, and this sort of thing. That it's sort of the social life of flotsam that I'm kind of interested in here, and that to me is an opportunity to really put alongside each other the very, very intimate and the very, very big simultaneously. And so I'm really trying to again think about those scales in operation with each other, and again really challenging this idea that this is a remote place at all. It's remote for some people, but not for the people who have been there for thousands of years.
All right, we have really wonderful questions coming in. I'm going to probably try to consolidate some of them if they have similar themes. But one that has popped up that didn't come up in our previous discussion, but I think is relevant to the work of many of you, is one from Anthony Adler, asking if the speakers could say a bit more about the non-human living inhabitants of the oceans, and if technology moderates our understanding of the seas, could the same be said about specific marine organisms humans have historically interacted with? Is it a step too far to assign agency to marine creatures in our ocean histories?
Gee, Bathsheba, why don't you take a stab at that one first?
There's a reason I asked that one, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I wasn't just being facetious. I would actually love to have Bathsheba address this at some point. From the work that I, do on indigenous marine space and thinking very critically about, concrete histories of indigenous relationality with marine spaces, it definitely does come to this point of, thinking historically about other than human relations, other than human kin, the categories that we normally call animals, and don't ascribe as historical actors. And so, from many coastal indigenous peoples' perspectives, this makes perfect sense. They have many, many stories and oral histories that they relate, where they explain what happens within the environment, within the specific ecology of their marine space, where they peg it to the agency of these other than human relations. When you violate your protocols, when you don't prepare properly, when you disrespect those members of the other than human relations, they retaliate. This isn't just kind of a Pocahontas style, oh, you're in love with nature, one with nature. That's just a bunch of BS. These are powerful beings who will make you pay if you do things wrong. And the only way that they will give themselves to you or acknowledge you in any reasonable way is if you respect them. So many indigenous epistemologies tied to the coast and tied to the ocean, frame those relationships that way. And again, others here can address this in very specific ways, and I'll let them talk about that.
I'm happy to jump in briefly if that's not, if not overstepping my role as chair. One of the things that I found in the research that I did for my first book, which is about the Bering Sea, are very specific examples of the ways in which marine mammals, which are the reasons why many people come to know the oceans in particular ways, is through relationships with whales and walruses and seals. It's what draws people out into marine space, both in indigenous practices and then later in capitalist and then socialist ones in the history that I looked at. is that those animals themselves very much shape those interactions, right? And you have to be kind of oblivious to what the historical record is telling you to not come up with that interpretation, I would say. It's present in the indigenous interpretations of what happened, it's present in the capitalist interpretations of what happened, and it's present in the socialist interpretations of what's going on, is that particularly whales, but also with other kinds of particularly marine mammals. I didn't look at fish, so I don't have a case study there. These are fully dynamic participants in the engagement, to the point that in the 19th century, the adaptations of bowhead whales caused the commercial fleet from New England to leave the Bering Strait as a whaling ground. The whales out adapted what it was that the commercial harvesters were able to do. Simultaneously, indigenous whalers were able to continue hunting as normal. And I interpret this essentially leaning on the indigenous traditions of what it is that whales are and how they behave in the world, as a rejection on the part of the whales to that particular mode of hunting. Obviously, other people have other ways of interpreting that. And I would just say that this response on the part of whale species, a paper came out just last week from a marine biologist named Hal Whitehead and a couple of other folks, which was actually based on conversations I had had with Hal about bowhead whales responding to commercial hunting. He went and did kind of big number crunching survey about sperm whales in the North Pacific and came up with the same set of results. And in the case of the sperm whales, has indications of the whales communicating with each other, basically teaching each other the danger of these commercial hunting vessels. So at least in the case of whales, in the part of the ocean that I know anything about, very much kind of agents that are participating in how people know the oceans and what people can do within that space.
While we're thinking about non-human agency, and I'll just second a lot of what's been said. These kinds of approaches definitely are shaping my thinking, but I also want to make a case for the agency of the non-human or the non-living. And one of the things that I've been really quite interested in is the afterlives of these wrecks as they sink into the sand and reemerge and sink and reemerge with storms and so on. They are animate in a way. And so thinking about how their behavior produces certain kinds of stories about place, I think is really important. And so I think that these, especially maybe coastal spaces, but really all of these marine spaces just provide such good opportunities for even just thinking about the question of what is alive, and really pushing some boundaries there, which I think we're certainly coming out of Indigenous studies, where I've been sort of centered the last decade or so. The pieces around non-human agency or more than human agency are really, really central. And so I'm trying to bring some of that back into what I'm doing as a more mainstream historian.
And Coll's comments just reminded me to throw in the category of coral, which is both living and also sort of a structure that has been viewed as dangerous to ships in the past and has come to be viewed as fragile. And just to point out, thanks for the question, Tony. I think you're right that we will find that specific organisms really are important in ways that we will come to think of as being perhaps analogous to the importance of technology. And I don't necessarily want to talk about pieces of work I've had specifically that I've had the fortune to read in draft form, but there are some graduate students and early career scholars doing incredibly interesting work in this area, in terms of pointing out not only are there charismatic megafauna, but there are charismatic microfauna that are especially important because of climate change and ocean acidification and things like that. That was a great recent paper I read. So I think this category of animal histories is really important. And I'll just throw out, I'm also familiar with Hal Whitehead's work and the book, his co-authored book, The Culture of Whales. But there's a really great book also by Jonathan Balcom, which argues that fish are sentient, and lays out all of the science behind that. And that is something that really ought to make us, even people doing fisheries history, stop and think about the fish perspective.
Yeah, and just a quick shout out that the work of Zoe Todd dealing with issues of fish pluralities has been really helpful in my own thinking about some of these issues too.
I'm going to try to lump together two questions that have to do with temporality and time, one from Jack Bouchard and then from David Eagler, thinking about temporal and to some extent spatial scale. David asks about how deep time can be part of ocean history, sort of how to tell that, what are the methods to build deep time consciously into our narrative studies of the ocean, which I think is related to something that Jack is asking about, the emphasis that I think many of us in this panel have, which is on ocean histories from the 18th to the 20th centuries, roughly. And he's asking, what are the questions that we can bring to pre-modern ocean history that need the most attention, and how we might move away from treating the 18th century as kind of the jumping off point that I think at least I am guilty of doing.
I think one way to think about that is to go back to something that Helen said earlier about the role of imagination, and by the time the 18th century is happening, there are such entrenched corpuses of, in the case of my study, of shipwreck knowledge and shipwreck stories that go back to the Egyptians, and certainly in kind of what we sometimes call the Western tradition, coming through Homer and so on. There are these long traditions with these, this is part of the challenge, is that the metaphors and the stories are so overdetermined. But I think thinking about the genealogy of those kinds of stories, which are quite deep, certainly in the European tradition, such as it is. And so I think story is one way to get at that deep time question, to bring, when a wreck happens in 1693 on the Oregon coast, it's not just happening in 1693. It's engaging histories that go back to 1492 to earlier than that as well. So I think story is one way to get at that.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that and to kind of speak directly to Dave's question about how it relates to my project. I mean, this is, my book is really rooted in the late 19th century, and I'm not pretending to do any sort of big history or deep time work. But when you asked that question, I was thinking about it, and one of the places where I really see an opportunity to open that story up was just the materiality of the ship. The ship I'm writing about, the Edwin Fox, was made mostly out of teak that was harvested in Burma. And it in writing that scene and in writing about the teak wood, it kind of pulled me back to think about the Irrawaddy Delta as itself a kind of space with a deep history of human and non-human relationships that all go into the creation of the tributaries that in the environment that allow for the growing of this remarkable teak tree, all of which kind of have to work to coalesce to bring this moment of building a ship, right? And thinking about those kinds of stories that we could tell even as we're kind of writing about a particular historical moment much later. As far as the question about the pre-modern, I think is the term that the questioner asked about, the themes of pre-modern. I mean, look, I think we're all kind of modern historians on this panel, so I can't say much about that. But I will say I recently read an interesting book, Fabio Rambelli's The Sea and the Sacred in Japan, Aspects of Maritime Religion. And he posed a very interesting question that I've been thinking about for the last couple of months ever since reading that book, which was, you've got Japan, this island nation, island culture, and yet religiously it's all about mountains. And when there is a kind of oceanic religious view, it's always relegated to Okinawa as a kind of a pre-modern people who have pre-modern religions, right? And modern religion is more mountain focused. And he kind of asks the question, how, why do societies turn towards the sea at certain moments for meaning, cultural meaning, and why do they turn away from it? And that's been a question I think that has interested me and has forced me to, as a modern historian, to kind of look back at the pre-modern era to try to help me better understand those questions. And I think that has bearings on our society today. I think we live in a society that is turning back towards the ocean after a long time of ignoring it. And I think, I don't know, I think the early modern period holds insights for us on that front.
Yeah, for me, the deep history angle is actually quite relevant because I think there's a growing movement, especially among Native historians doing Indigenous history, to think about the Indigenous longue durée. So often, American Indian or Indigenous history is framed by colonialism. Settlers come and everything goes to hell. And it's like there's so much more that is happening if we reframe our histories away from just that blip. It's a catastrophic blip in many ways, but there's so much more to that. And so in thinking about the, Indigenous longue durée, or, in the work that I do, the Makah longue durée, it gets into, those, long-running oral histories. It invites us to consider some of the archaeology around that Cape Flattery area, the histories that Makahs tell about their own people from what today we call the pre-modern era. Like those accounts of Makahs going up to Haida Gwaii, those come from hundreds of years before non-natives came to this corner. And it's kind of part of this, within this kind of assumption or what we think we know about the past of the Pacific Northwest. The Haida were the ones coming down from the north and raiding into Puget Sound, and all kinds of Native nations and communities set up, big, beacon fires to warn each other when they were coming. And Makahs are like, well, sorry, we kind of might have started that by first going up to Haida Gwaii and taking some slaves there. And the Haidas are like, oh no, that isn't how it happened. And so you get these interesting contested histories when you start to, especially delve into the Indigenous longue durée, unsurprisingly. So it's, so that's my own framework, because not only does that unpack that deeper Indigenous past, but I think it also helps us better realize Indigenous futures. When we think about, Indigenous timeframes within their own epistemological understandings. So that's where it's become very valuable in my own work.
And I would just like to say that I think the early modern period is one of the biggest needs in terms of understanding better the relationship between people and oceans. I sense that literary scholars have done a better job. Certainly the leadership of Steve Mentz in that area is influential, and others. But I also think that it could be that one reason why historians haven't done as much work on ocean-oriented histories of earlier periods has to do with what John Gillis calls the second discovery of the sea, which rendered the ocean into this kind of timeless place. And for me, when I worked on my book, Vast Expanses, I sort of started out with the assumption, okay, the ocean's timeless. But it very quickly became clear to me that if you're looking before the late 18th century and looking outside of, the kind of dominant Western imperial powers, it was not timeless. It was not perceived as timeless. It was not lived and experienced as timeless in any way, shape, or form. And so, I think that the oceanic turn is starting to happen. I mean, Jack's, your work is super interesting to me. And I think that we're going to learn a lot about the relationship between people and oceans in a time period that we really need to know more soon.
All right, I'm going to do sort of a lightning round. I apologize that we're not going to get to all of the questions on the queue. They have been really wonderful and have required some kind of in-depth responses. I'm going to ask Madison Heslop's question about the relationship between ocean worlds and the history of capitalism, kicked off, as she points out, by the fact that there is still a tanker stuck in the Suez Canal as we speak, clogging up, large parts of the world's shipping traffic. And then ask a follow-up question from Sean Fraga about books that you have read recently, expanding your thinking about oceans and their history. So if you can tag on a reading recommendation to your summation of global capitalism, that would be great.
Well, I'll jump in and try that. For me, it's very difficult, at least currently as I'm thinking about the project, to distinguish between colonialism and capitalism, just given the time frame that I'm working with, and that is largely the later 19th century and after, where, aside from the fur trade, industrial capitalism kind of comes with the ships, and sort of settler colonialism is industrial capitalism here in this part of the world, at least. So I've been trying to think about that. And so, for example, I'm thinking about a wreck in 1999 called the New Carissa on the Oregon coast. And it was an empty tanker that wrecked and broke apart and spilled oil and then was burned off using napalm and things like this. It was very dramatic. And I'm thinking about the emptiness of that hold and the value of that emptiness as kind of an indicative or sort of a metaphor for late capitalism more generally, and trying to think about how these encounters with marine disaster actually are tracking with the history of capitalism, including its failures. That these are moments to really think about how the sort of the house of cards that we call capitalism seems to be working. And in terms of things that I've been reading recently, one of the books that I've read that I still think about a lot is Riniso Mwani's book on the Komagata Maru. She's a colleague here at UBC, a sociologist, but really works like a historian in many ways. And so her book on the law of the sea and how it intersects with race and with settler colonialism as well as racial capitalism is really, really, really good work. It's called Across the Oceans of Law, for folks who don't know that.
I mean, what can I say? Coll just said it all. These things are I cannot. I saw that question in the Q&A, and I was kind of struggling because I was like, I can't differentiate. I can't separate history of capitalism from oceanic history. My brain is completely amalgamated into a single thing. So yes, in other words. I think I would reiterate the Komagata Maru reference. That was a great book. I think I mentioned earlier Crossing the Bay of Bengal. I think that is such a really interesting book that really helped me rethink assumptions that I had that were really deep. And then I guess in a kind of in my continual effort to kind of break down, I think it's kind of a false dichotomy between terrestrial history and ocean history. Like, let's just kind of like smash them all together again. I recently reread Sven Beckert's History of Cotton as an oceanic history, and it totally works. I'm just saying.
Yeah, great set of questions. And, this is one of the reasons why, we're, asking people to throw into the chat some recommendations. We have our own recommendations, but we know that that's just scratching the surface, and that the audience has many. I would second the books that Coll and Boyd also mentioned. And of course, Bathsheba's book, The Floating Coast, has been really, really helpful for me at thinking critically about this, especially with the intersection, a clear intersection with environmental history and whatnot. But for me, I also think a little, I do move us beyond, or I like to think beyond just the automatic link of oceans and capitalism. And again, I think this is where the indigenous longue durée can help us start to move a little beyond that. At times, capitalism, of course, kind of reorients many of these relationships with the ocean, but many indigenous relationships, even though they engage robustly with the global capital markets that come in, macaws are selling tens of thousands of gallons of whale oil to non-natives in the mid-19th century. They're annually pulling up over, 1 million tons, pounds of halibut and selling it in the 1880s. They have been, doing these practices for a very long time before capitalism came in, and they were exchanging them in, commercial ways before that too. So, I think there is a bit more, of course, to that story, and this is where I think really paying attention to the history of some of these relationships from the perspectives of particularly indigenous peoples can really help.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. That's helpful because there is the kind of temptation to throw your hands up and say, "Oh, it's all capitalism." But maybe we should, think about that a little more. I don't know that I have that much to say about that, but I want to throw in for my book recommendation. I completely understand what Boyd is saying, but I think that there is room for stories that center on oceans, and we need more of them. And a good example of that is Joy McCann's Wild Sea. It's beautifully written, it's meticulously researched, it tells a really fascinating story about the Southern Ocean. And I think we need more stories like that, alongside more stories of the sort that Boyd and Coll are writing, and Josh has written. So I guess I would throw that out there.
Could you say the title of that book again, Helen?
Sure, Wild Sea by Joy McCann.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would say, if I can add a recommendation, this book by, sorry, I covered up the title, Alexis Pauline Gumbs Undrowned, which is a kind of, it defies any kind of disciplinary categorization, but it's one of the most just blows your hair back works of marine and marine mammal writing that I have read recently. Cannot recommend it enough. She's not a historian, but I think that there are ways in which she writes about animals and particularly navigates that question of what is metaphor and what is material, essentially by ignoring the difference that are, I think, really useful to the questions that Coll raised earlier. We are more or less out of time. We have like 90 seconds left. I would really like to thank everyone for coming today. This had such an amazing attendance. There were so many good questions. I'm really sorry that we didn't get to all of them. The link to the Google document with a kind of shared bibliography and other kinds of resources is in the chat, but it will also be linked to when this, when the HA panel goes up. So you'll be able to find it through the HA also. I briefly had it turned so that you couldn't access it, but now everyone should be able to add and contribute things that they have found. And I would really like to thank the panelists for all their answers. I learned a great deal, and to everyone at the AHA.
Thank you. That concludes our conversation today. We will put the recording of the webinar up on the AHA YouTube channel in about a week or two, and we'll add a link to that Google Doc. Thank you again to our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions, and a special thanks to our panelists today. Have a great day. Thank you.